Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear esteemed members of the Dissertation Council, dear guests, dear colleagues. Let me start the meeting of the Dissertation Council for the defense of the dissertation written by Ivan Ivanovich Malyshin to seek the degree of candidate of economic sciences in the specialism economic theory, and the topic is the evolution of tools of economic policy of Russia in the late 19th century, the early 20th century. Let me open this assembly. By the decree of St. Petersburg State University of the 2nd of October 2017, I, Gennady Grigorievich Bogomazov, Doctor of Economic Sciences, Professor, was appointed the chairman of this Dissertation Council. Also, I would like to introduce my colleagues who are serving today on the board of the Dissertation Council. Ivan Alexeyevich Blagich, Professor of Department of History of Economics and the Economic Thought of the Economics Faculty of St. Petersburg State University, Doctor of Economics, Economic Sciences, Professor. Dmitry Yuryevich Miropovsky, Head of Department of World Economic Theory and the History of Economic Thought, St. Petersburg State University, St. Petersburg Economics University, Doctor of Economic Sciences, Professor. Oleg Sergeyevich Sukharev, Head of the Laboratory of Institutional Economics of the Institute of Market Problems to the Russian Academy of Sciences, Doctor of Economic Sciences, Professor. Petr Sergeyevich Lemeshenko, Head of Department of Theoretical and Institutional Economics of the Economic Faculty of Belarus State University, Doctor of Economic Sciences, Professor. I would like to mention here that according to the federal law, Federal Law number 127 on science and state scientific and technical policy, St. Petersburg State University was granted the right to issue its own degrees, academic degrees, and a relevant decree on the procedure of granting academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University, on whose basis we are conducting this session, was issued on the 1st September 2016. In accordance with this procedure, we are conducting this. Our Dissertation Council consists of 5 members. All members are present. The duration of this session will not exceed 2 hours. The procedure includes, number 1, short report of the chairman about the main items of main points of the academic degree paperwork in compliance with the relevant requirements and possible answers to possible questions. Then a short presentation of the defendant covering the main issues of the dissertation. Questions to the defendant strictly on the basis of his or her presentation and the answers, then reading out the reviews. All the reviews were uploaded to the website of St. Petersburg State University and are available there. They represent then statements from members of the Dissertation Council with their positions, with questions and comments and recommendations, not more than 10 minutes, and also concrete, and then of course 5 minutes, and then answers of the defendant to these questions, not more than 15 minutes. Then an open discussion that would involve anyone present, but who only those who had entered their name and the register list for speakers. Number 8, concluding answers of the defendant to the questions, not more than 5 minutes. Then presentation, then a statement from the scientific supervisor of the defendant, not more than 3 minutes, and then a break of 5 minutes before open voting in order to allow the members of the Dissertation Council to discuss the issue on granting or non-granting of the third degree. The open voting by name and the counting of votes by the chairman of the Dissertation Council and entering the results in the protocol, and then taking a decision on granting or non-granting of the sought academic degree of St. Petersburg State University, and then the concluding word of the defendant on not more than 2 minutes. Thank you very much. I also inform you that audio and visual recording is on, and also is accompanied by simultaneous interpretation, and the audio and video recording is broadcast live on the website of St. Petersburg State University. And this is the time for me to make my short presentation. The dissertation of Ivan Ivanovich Malyshin to seek the academic degree of candidate of economic sciences in the specialism economic theory, on the topic the evolution of tools of economic policy of Russia in the late 19th century to the early 20th century, was accepted for defense by the decree of academic secretary of St. Petersburg State University on the 4th of October 2017. The Dissertation Council was established by the decree of the Academic Council of St. Petersburg State University on the 2nd of October. The defendant submitted the following paperwork to the Academic Council, to the Dissertation Council: personal statement addressed to the rector of St. Petersburg State University, Professor Nikolai Mikhailovich Kropichev, asking to consider the dissertation for defense as dated the 4th of September 2017. Review of the academic advisor, Professor of Department of History of Economics and Economic Thought, Associate Professor Dubansky. The list of publications consists of 10 works, where key points are covered, including 5 articles that are published in the peer-reviewed academic publications that are listed on the list by the approved by the Minister of Education, Russian Federation. Then a certificate on completion of a postgraduate course, which states that Malyshin Ivan Ivanovich studied from between 2013 and the present time in the postgraduate course of St. Petersburg State University in economic theory. Then a conclusion on the recommendation of the dissertation for defense that is issued by the Vice Rector for Academic Works in St. Petersburg State University, Mr. Aplonov. The diploma of the master's degree in the field of economics, which states that Mr. Malyshin holds a master's degree in the specialism. Dissertation, both in hard copy and soft copy, that complies with the requirements of state requirements of Russia, that is submitted as well. Also, I would like to now give the floor to the the defendant for a short presentation of 15 minutes. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, the topic of this dissertation, you can see on the slide, the economic tools of economic policy of Russia at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. Well, at the time, the goal is to identify the tools that is used by the state to further a sovereign economic policy. And of course, to identify these tools, you have to identify what policy is being conducted. Of course, we have to refer to the history of this thought. And so different historical epochs, the modernization of Russia involve different tools, and the tools that were used in the post-reform Russia were a very distinct set. And the research of the evolution of these tools is a very important contribution to the development of economic theory. Now we're living through sanctions and the economic blockade, which already happened in the history of Russia, and therefore the Russian government is using non-standard tools in its economic theory, and that reflects in major degree the experience that we are concentrating in our research. And that was offered by Prime Minister Stolypin and others. And of course, a lot of works focus on this period. And we think that we have to state that during when we analyze this period, when did identify different ways of looking at these things. First of all, we set before us the following tasks: identify the stages in the genesis of the tools of economic policy in pre-revolutionary Russia, and on this basis the close successive links, identify contradictions arising from the non-linearity of its evolution, internal reforms and external influence, to substantiate the interrelation and interdependence of the genesis and the evolution of the tools of economic policy of the great powers in the context of state monopoly capitalism, to determine the place of industrialization policy in the evolution of the tools of Russia's economic policy at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. And of course, the subject of the study to show the distinctiveness of schools and trends exploring the tools of economic policy and determine the influence of theoretical attitudes on the practical actions of the state. The subject of the study is the economic policy in post-reform Russia, the peculiarities of the mutual influence of theory and practice in the elaboration of economic policy instruments during this period. The theoretical and methodological basis of the research is indicated on slide 5. The work used a dialectical approach and the comparative historical method of investigation. The first chapter, the influence of the reforms of 1861 to 1864 on the formation of the toolkit for Russia's economic policy. Theoretical foundations were considered that set the direction for the development of economic policy instruments related to capitalist reforms and the proofreading of tools under the influence of internal and external conditions. In the first paragraph of the shattered theoretical foundation of the practical directions for the development of the toolkit for the economic policy of the state, theoretical sources are considered that reveal the genesis of ideas about economic policy and instruments. It is shown how the division of instrumentation, which operated by theoretical political economy and and the theory of economic policy, took place. And of course, it is pointed out that among the state institutions initiating until the outbreak of the First World War of volitional influence on the tools of economic policy was first of all the Minister of Finance. Because the influence on the economic policy of the few financial instruments applied during the redemption operation, banknotes and the redemption certificates, is analyzed. It is concluded that both the internal and the external economic policies of post-reform Russia were controversial. The model of catching up with the West, this kind of development, was implemented, and Russia was drawn into the customs war, especially with Germany, which ultimately led to an armed clash. In the field of domestic policy, there were also serious problems that led to the revolution. And of course, in the second paragraph, the evolution of economic policy instruments and the counter-reforms, the so-called counter-reforms of 1881, 18 to 95, we analyze the reign of Alexander III, and under the leadership of Minister Bunge, government developed a toolkit for monitoring the social responsibility for business laws regulating the payment of labor, factory and insurance legislation, and institution of tax. Factory and sanitary inspectors, zemstvo heads, surveyors, and statisticians were introduced at the time. Liquidated by the reforms of 1861, specialized banks for agricultural crediting, small agricultural and land cultivation credit, agrarian corporation, and other institutions that practically applied one or another tool for economic policy of the state were reinstated and developed. In the third paragraph, influence of protection policy on the toolkit of economic policy, the evolution of instruments of trade and industrial policy were investigated. Next, we consider measures related to the development of a toolkit for conventional, constructural, and autonomous or unilaterally established customs tariffs. Since from 1895, trade representative offices of Russia were actively formed abroad. A network of consular institutions cooperating with trade agencies and banking institutions were developing. In the second chapter, Instrumentation of Economic Policy in the Epoch of State Monopoly Capitalism, examines the evolution of the toolbox of Russia's economic policy until from 1895 to 1914. In the first paragraph, we have long-term economic policy analysis. It is not noted that the set of reforms conducted by Prime Minister of Finance Witte far exceeded the scope of powers that both formally and the structure of an administrative apparatus that were possessed by the Minister of Finance. And in order to boost domestic industry, the government initiated protectionist measures in order to combat economic crisis and increase the competitiveness of domestic products and agricultural products in the domestic and foreign markets. In 1905, the Ministry of Trade and Industry was established to manage the industrial policy instruments more efficiently, and from that year, the Council of Ministers became a permanent body. And the following is a brief description of the reasons that led to the formation of the State Duma as a result of the revolutionary event 2000, and of course the third and of course the meaning of that was very important, because under the jurisdiction of the Duma there was state regulation of incomes and expenses, revenues and expenses, reports of state control and on the use of state funds, the establishment of shareholder companies, the construction of railways, etc., etc. The third paragraph examines the impacts of entrepreneurial unions and associations on the toolkit of state's economic policy. This led to the government losing a lot of regulation controls, and of course the views, aspirations and activities of individuals and their associations that relate to the personal and material relations of the country with other countries' counterparts in the domestic market influence the formation and certain situations deform the tools of the state economic policy to serve their own interests. Thus, it is according to the analysis, the following research results were formulated, and that, of course, manifests the research originality of the topic of the research. It is justified that since the second half of the 19th century, the economic policy of the great powers to which Russia belonged began to be determined within the framework of the concepts of national political economy and national interests. And it is proved that Russia's active policy of industrialization conducted at the turn of the 19th, 20th century led in general to the formation of state monopoly capitalism in Russia, the formation of state-private monopolies, vertically integrated companies in financial industrial groups, banking syndicates, and the banking oligarchy. And substantiated practical differences, practical recommendations for government bodies were formulated in the dissertation, and of course the conclusions and the results obtained are applicable to the theoretical substantiation of the tools of Russia's long-term economic policy, which is a strategy area oriented towards the realization of national interest and full sovereignty. The main provisions of the thesis can be used in teaching courses taught in higher educational institutions of the in the economics field, public service and management, history of economic policy, economic history of Russia, history of economic thought in Russia, history of state and municipal institutions. The theoretical significance of the work lies in the fact that the results obtained allow us to better understand the laws of genesis and evolution of instruments of economic policy. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
My question is as follows. Why do you overlook Stolypin in your dissertation? Why don't you mention Stolypin? Would you like to take all the questions first, and then, or would you like to have a Q&A session? Well, I would like to answer this question straightforwardly. Thank you very much for this question. Yes, indeed. If we compare the analysis to Bunge, Witten, Vyshegradski, and Witte, yes, indeed, Stolypin is somewhat overlooked in my dissertation, and I will be aware of this fact in the future. Professor Sukharev, what do you mean by an instrument of economic policy? On one of the slides, you mentioned the instruments of economic policy, and one of them was a non-equivalent exchange. What do you mean by that? And how come that this concept is an instrument? What is there? What makes it an instrument? A non-equivalent exchange is a phenomenon. It's just a ratio, but how come you give it a title of an instrument, of a tool? And whether it is a tool indeed. Yes, and an unequivalent exchange is when we merge the governmental interests with oligarchy. And yes, and penetration. Is it an instrument or a process? Thank you very much for the question. Probably the title on the slide is inaccurate and the wording is inaccurate. So those are not instruments in the classical understanding. It is just a range of tools, a range of leverages in economics, which reflected the response to a long-term economic policy that was initiated by Witte once he was appointed Minister of Finance. May I ask a question as well? In the time frame under consideration, this time frame has seen a very extensive growth in Russian economics, but a crisis as well. How did policies and how did instruments change within these years? And whether there were any changes of that kind? Well, the turning point is the year of 1862, when the serfdom was abolished, and in fact, the country was absolutely dependent on the West and exported a lot of raw materials in the West. And this is what I'm discussing in the second chapter. There was an entire range of instruments that were implemented on a regular basis. This is it for your part, colleagues. More questions? Professor Blagich, please, your question. My question is simple. What were you guided by when you made your decision about this topic? But this topic is vast. Well, actually, I was hinted to embark on this topic by way of the following developments. Initially, I started as a postgraduate at the Economic Politics department with Leonid Sherbakov, and the topic of my dissertation was Genesis and the Evolution of Instruments in Russia's Economic Policies. But then I had to change the department, so I became the postgraduate of the theory of economics and the history of economic thought. And therefore, I had to change the wording of my topic so as not to jettison what has already been done by that time. Is that it? Please, Professor Lemeshenko, I have a simple question, or possibly it will be not simple. Recently we celebrated the anniversary, the 100 years anniversary of the Great October Revolution, but actually it has, people call it names. Speaking about the tools and instruments, the October Revolution, is it a favorable, is it a good tool for the economic policy or not? Was the economic evolution a logical result of the revolution, a logical result of the some of the economic tools or not? Well, actually, the 100 years anniversary of the revolution made us decide whether it was a positive or a negative event. And the future developments in Russian history were impacted by the revolution a lot. When analyzing the past, we should not deny the fact that there was a lot of influence, a lot of impact exercised by economic instruments. And the population, the Russian population, was unsatisfied with the economic developments in the country, and thus the economic instruments were conducive of the revolution to some extent. I did not consider some specific impacts of these economic instruments on the revolution, but I believe that this is a very exciting dimension to investigate into. Thank you. Do we have any more questions, colleagues? There are no questions. All members of the dissertation board submitted their reports. Professor Blagich, Professor Bogomazov, Professor Lemeshenko, Professor Mirapolsky, and Professor Sukharev. All of the reports were duly submitted on time as per point 19 of the academic degree awarding procedure and were promptly downloaded to the St. Petersburg University website. Let's proceed to the reports. May I start with my report, the report by Professor Bogomazov. First and foremost, I would like to highlight that the research is highly relevant. The knowledge of the economic theory expands our scope. It promotes professional growth. What's more, such research papers compel us to respect our own history, the history of our own country, and make some lessons learned for the future. The dissertation submitted by Mr. Malyshin analyzes the economic instruments implemented in the post-reform Russia in the late 19th, early 20th century. This is the time frame when Russia was pursuing the economy of capitalism, which justifies the relevance of this research. By now, many abstract and theoretical aspects of economic tools have been studied. However, this topic has a vast untapped potential, which allowed Mr. Malyshin to deliver on his objectives. This research is a very thorough analysis of economic instruments within the time frame indicated. This topic has been overlooked so far because of the First World War and followed by the October Revolution. The dissertation is evidence-based because it refers to a vast amount of works and books by Vernadsky, von Soden, Mendeleev, Kulischer, a very famous historian of economics, Lebedev, Goldstein, Yashenko, and so on and so forth. The defendant, by mentioning the very well-known opinions of high-caliber researchers, formulates his own view on the economic instruments of the above-mentioned time span. In particular, I should highlight his conclusions about how specific economics instruments were at the stage of national economy, at the stage of the extreme development of world and national economy. The theoretical relevance of the research is also undoubtful. This research is a contribution to the theory of economic policy and its instruments in particular. The practical relevance of this research is also significant because the conclusions can be included into the student curricula and textbooks for students who study history and economics. The key role has always been played by the Minister of Finance, and this is what the defendant underscores. His conclusion is that from 1980s to early 20th century, Russia saw the emergence of social and economic instruments, including monetary regulation and stimulation and promotion of growth by way of agricultural, social, foreign, and tax policy. The key provisions of the dissertation are very well evidence-based and are highly valuable because they are novel. Those include, first, the defendant analyzed the existing approaches to the phenomenon of economic functions in Russia. Second, the conclusion saying that after 1980s, a long time of economic dependency followed for Russia, when Russia was largely dependent on the West, and this exercised a huge impact on its economic settings. Third, when analyzing the customs, the banking policies, the defendant claims that the key decision-making criteria was were loans and the foreign investments from France in particular. The fourth, the defendant has proved the fact that from 1895 to 1914, Russia saw an intensive emergence of a liberal model in economics. 5. On pages 43 to 50, the author meticulously analyzes how specific national policies were in economics, and especially amid industrialization, when the resources were drained from the agricultural sector to the industrial sector. Fourth, the dissertation shows how the very foundation of the Russian policy has changed and was transformed from European to more of an Eastern and Asian pattern. I should note that there are lots of facts mentioned and the statistics is abundant. However, there are some recommendations and some scope for discussion. Therefore, my questions are as follows. First, I believe that you should be more specific in distinguishing the instruments and the practices within the indicated time frame. Second, there is narrow financism and there is broad economism. And therefore my question, are there any other differences between these two types of politics? The transformation in the early 20th century from the European Balkanian to the Asian, Persian and Chinese pattern is justified by the politics of Witte. Could it be that this is very typical for countries of peripheral capitalism? And lastly, while I was reading your dissertation, I still see that you have no specific opinion about the separation rights. And separate deals. What's your take on that? To conclude, I would like to mention that the dissertation submitted in compliance with the requirements for the academic degree of Doctor of Philosophy in Economics is in conformity with the requirements stipulated in the decree as of September 1, 2016, whereas Mr. Malyshin deserves to be awarded the inspired academic degree of Doctor of Philosophy in Economics in the field 080001 Theoretical Economics. Professor Bogomazov, November 15, 2017. Signature. Next speaker is Mr. Blagich. I'm in favor of the defendant. I believe that this was a successful research. It is in compliance with the requirement for this type of research under the academic degree awarding procedure in St. Petersburg State University. Overall, I would like to say that the topic is highly exciting, because if we look at contemporary textbooks in economic policies, there we would find some instruments of current regulation. It is yet unclear from the existing textbooks what do those mean by the new economic policy or by the new economic policy of Roosevelt or the economic policy of Witte. You cannot say that an economic policy is some engineering in economics. There should be some specific tools, some specific criteria and traits of an economic policy that would make some actions into an integral policy. So how did it take place? How did the economic policy unfold in Russia? What were the tools? What were the levers of it? And how all of them together interacted with one another? And how come that the initiative to instill capitalism in Russia actually failed? In this respect, the dissertation by Mr. Malyshin is highly exciting and thoughtful. It provides a deep insight into the economic theory, into its fundamentals, as well as some deeper theoretical understanding of the economic policy and its instruments. However, me too would like to provide some questions to the defendant. In your dissertation, you identify two stages. In the description of the two stages, you say that the instruments of economic policy within the relevant period were enriched by the long-term policies as an instrument. In the second chapter, the defendant draws the conclusions and the general takeaway. However, he fails to highlight what makes this second stage specific as different from the first stage. On the one hand, it is clear if we look at Kudrin's finance policy, we can see that on the one hand there is a budget. It is like a box with money, and it is the minister who has to treasure it, who has to safeguard it. But in his speech on TV, Mr. Kudrin said that if we do away with the economy, who would benefit from this budget, which is intact, which is positive. Therefore, my question, the Minister of Finance wanted to transform the European policy into an Asian-type policy. We know that Russia had some issues with the Eastern Europe, and all of a sudden there is the Russian-Japanese war, and Russia is stripped of its title of a power, of a global power, because it was considered as a colony of European Western countries. What we have is that a colonial country, colonial power, lost a war to a colony. But how come that these developments took place? Was it the Minister of Finance who transformed the entire policy, Russian policy, from the Western type to a more of an Asian type? And lastly, what is the relevance for today's Russia of entrepreneurial unions on the governmental policy? The defendant mentioned oligarchs, but I would like Mr. Malyshin to be more clear about this issue once he is having this analysis. So these are my remarks and recommendations. Dmitry Miropolsky, your report, please. Dear colleagues, the dissertation submitted by Mr. Malyshin is highly relevant, theoretically and practically. The conclusions of the dissertation are very well justified. However, as in the previous dissertation, I would like to highlight the fact that the defendant is overlooking the contemporary discussions of the developments of the past. The conclusions are very evidence-based and trustworthy. As for the novelty, yes, indeed, these conclusions include a lot of novel statements. As for some scope for discussion and recommendations, as well as criticism, those are as follows. First, the dissertation is about the instruments in economic policy. However, nowhere in the dissertation have I found the description of such instruments. The instruments of economic policy are merged with the economic policy of its own kind. And this same thing we see on the slides, which means that there is no due understanding of what an instrument of economic policy is. Could you please clarify this aspect? As a result, we don't know how a particular instrument emerged in Russia, whether it was efficient or not, when its potential was exhausted. This is something which is missing in the text. My second aspect of criticism is lack of statistics. The same stood true for the first defense today. The defendant refers to already published sources, There are no archived materials, no statistics, and this invalidates your conclusions largely. Next point, there's a lack of structure. Let's look at the first chapter and the first paragraph. The historical situation at the early 19th century. Then this analysis includes the concept by von Zorden and Elist. To wrap up, so there is no clear link between the first part of the paragraph and the second part. In the second paragraph, you start right away by showing the challenges of the post-reform Russia. To jump onto Bunge, and those are intertwined with his views, the activities, what Bunge did and what he thought was right. But this is practice and theory, and practice and theory coincide rarely, and rarely do they match. This is a well-known fact. So the analysis of the economic policy is intertwined with the analysis of the views of economists, referring to the developments in the economic policies. So it should be very distinctive here. It should be more clear-cut here, because you do not discern between the policy and the views of policy, the perception of this policy. Those are two things apart. So once the serfdom was abolished, you embark on the market way of development. But how would you explain the transgression from the market economy to what we saw in the Soviet Russia? So it would be very valuable to have some comparison between the instruments of the past and contemporary instruments in this respect. However, all of these points of criticism do not invalidate the results and the conclusions of the dissertation. Therefore, the dissertation is in compliance with all the requirements, whereas Mr. Malyshin deserves to be awarded the aspired academic degree. Thank you so much, Mr. Sukharev. Distinguished colleagues, good afternoon. My report is positive. Overall, this dissertation, in terms of its stronger points and positive points, are very much similar to what Mr. Chairman has already mentioned. Therefore, I'm not going to focus on all the gory details of my report, especially considering that my report is available online. My critical remarks also echo the remarks that have already been said by my colleagues. There is one, however, aspect that I would like to add. My general impression of this research is that it is a research that provides an evaluation of this historical time frame based on the resources that were available to the author. So the key drawback, this is what I'm getting at, the key drawback of this dissertation is how you formulate your objective. It is too general. If you had a more specific objectives, for example, you analyzed the monetary and the credit policy. This is a very specific instrument, and there are specific works that are devoted to this particular instrument. For example, the research on Russia's banking system published by a contemporary researcher who is still alive. He's approximately roughly 60 years, Professor Andryusha, Sergei Andryusha. He also analyzed the impact of WIT and his policy in Russian history, and he published a 3-volume work with Figurovskaya and Shabalkin. So Professor Andryusha was an expert in Russia's banking policy in the second part of the 19th century.
Задача в общем поставлена.
So the objective is there, and the defendant delivered on this objective as successfully as he could, as aptly as he could, I should say. So you identify 3 stages. Why not make a table to every stage and to identify the scope of instruments that were relevant for this particular stage in Russia's history? But before you proceed on doing that, why not provide a definition of what an instrument is? What are the types of instruments? Professor Blagich said that long-term instruments are just a too simplified version of what an economic policy is. There are short-term instruments as well. There is operational policy, and there is a strategy, an economic strategy. I'm not sure that Russia had an economic strategy in our modern understanding of this concept. Or equally, I'm not sure that the economics was able to stipulate for all of the range of methods that are well known today. However, the Timberlin-Tail model of instruments could have been implemented to analyze this particular time frame so as to identify the laws, the logic of the evolution that you're speaking about. And in the way some scattered instruments were implemented, whereas it is not obvious whether those instruments were long-term or short-term. My colleague has rightly mentioned that some of the instruments ceased to be relevant, whereas others stepped in. What's more, in the process of interaction, the instruments could reinforce each other or undermine each other. But I'm fully sensitized to the fact that this is an objective which is unmatched for a candidate dissertation. However, this initial failure resulted in just a very general takeaway, without any specific assessments, and rather biased assessments, I should say, and in the way these instruments were implemented. However, what I had an impression that these instruments were implemented absolutely chaotically. There was just a havoc of these instruments. There is no logic behind them, and you don't show the logic. However, the overall idea that these instruments were necessary, they were demanded, and they resulted in a booming economy in Russia by the beginning of the First World War, result in the conclusion that it is the First World War that invalidated the results obtained and generated by these instruments. But how would you explain it, considering the length of the working day, which was approximately 14 hours a day? And jointly, this is what undermined the economy. But as of 1914, social challenges were so dramatic, so painful, that over 80% of the population was illiterate. They could not write their name, they just put a cross instead of their name. So this huge discrepancy between the oligarchs and the regular population resulted in an unprecedented contradiction, an unprecedented conflict, and the government failed to solve this conflict, to mitigate it, to reconcile the patriarchal rural areas and the industrialized urban areas. This conflict was fueled by the conflict in urban areas between the proletariat and the industrial oligarchs that were in conflict with the conservative and the monarch groups. This is basically what the industrial oligarchs wanted. So my impression is that you aspired to cover an enormous scope of questions. Oh, to some way, you provide some conclusions. Some of them are just regular and simple. Some of them are just descriptive. I very much loved your description of the transformation from financism to economics and the industrial policies. This is the most valuable aspect of your dissertation. My final decision is in favor of your dissertation because this is a highly exciting framework, because it underwent through a lot of reforms. The historical examples when the instruments implemented did not result in any solution of most burning problems, most burning challenges. And this is what we actually track in your dissertation, because many of these instruments did not yield any solution, including the institutional and political instruments and challenges. But this is actually the situation that we are facing today. There are lots of programs, there are lots of instruments implemented, but the ultimate takeaway is close to zero. So this comparison, historically, in a historical perspective, would be highly valuable. And therefore, my positive decision in favor of your dissertation, with all the discrepancies and with all the gaps, I will vote in favor of your research. Thank you. Professor Leshenko? Lemeshenko. Yes, Lemeshenko, not Leshenko after all. Dear colleagues, my conclusion is positive.
У меня, например, привыкла тем, что таких работ очень мало. Сегодня идут дискуссии о разных языках.
This topic is very relevant. There are lots of discussions devoted to this topic and discussing what an instrument of economic policy is and how to analyze these instruments. Is it some logic, or is it culture, a matter of culture? And if it is a matter of culture, then it is a matter of history as well, whereas history is a trend, a long-term trend that identifies the genetics, the DNA of a particular citizen, as well as the DNA of a particular country. In Russia and in Belarus, we did a lot of research so as to determine where all the developments are going, what we are about, where we are getting at. It was not a simple task, I should say. This research indicated that universal methods have to be tailored to the particular specific setting of a specific country and its people and its culture. There is yet another important aspect. As my colleague said, the overall scope of the research is absolutely fundamental. They have over 172 sources. Impressive. Well, after all, one exciting dimension is whether it is possible to interpret these instruments in terms of different historical epochs. For example, new people come, right? Times change, the technologies are different. But how does this impact the economic policy? How does it impact the strategies of this policy and its objectives? There is yet another aspect. This research is pursuing to stay neutral. There are two approaches to analyze the past. This is to view the past from the perspective of the future and to view the past from the perspective of the present. Both of these perspectives have their drawbacks and positive aspects. But the paradigm should be different. Quite rarely do we see research that is that unbiased. I could compare it with the works by Plekhanov, Lenin, who considered the developments in Russia and adjacent regions. If I were the author of this dissertation, I would have chosen a different structure, but I'm not the author of this dissertation, and I believe that the structure of the dissertation delivers on the objectives identified. I'm not going to repeat the ideas that have already been said. It is undoubtedly a novel research, even in the formulation of the key objective. Well, to be frank, when we look on the history of Russia, we see how complicated this process is, and it is just an adventure when you start analyzing something. The results of a specific time period are always something unknown, and you have no idea whether it is the result of the past development or whether it is a forerunner of the future events. As for the points of criticism, I should, as Professor Sukharev said, there are some books and authors who are not there, who you have not referred to. For example, a number of scholars of the Soviet time. It would have been valuable to have them in your dissertation. Next. It's very difficult to prove something. Well, and the dissertation is there to show that this dissertation is highly important for history and for the theory of economics overall. So it would be valuable to have some comparison with the present developments. Third, when reading the chapter about the instruments of protectionism, my impression is that the point of view of the author is that the protectionism favored Russia's economy more than any other types of policies. Well, I think it's an exciting opinion. However, I saw no discrimination between the different types of economic instruments. So the economic instruments were the same, but the policies, the economic policies were different as a result. How come? Next, the defendant believes that the policies by Chernyshevsky, Lenin, Ulyanov, Tugaranovsky impacted the overall mechanism of administration. And yes, it's indeed right, but in fact, what the defendant means here and what is meant here, if you refer to some other scholars, you could equally have a different interpretation in this respect. However, these aspects do not invalidate the overall results of your research. It is a highly practical and functional research, and we are having just a full-fledged scholar. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Lemeshenko. I would like now to give the floor to the defendant for him to provide his responses to the recommendations in the reports.
Dear members of the Dissertation Council, thank you very much for your thorough analysis, for your comments. I would like to comment on your comments and the criticism that you've provided in the order of that they were supplied. Thank you very much for your questions about the stages of economic policy. The 70 years of economic history that in pre-revolutionary Russia, and that involved protectionism and other areas. And of course, Witte, Vishnegradsky, and Bunge all pursued their own policy. Well, whether we have to, whether we want to tie these figures, these economic figures to concrete stages or not, it was a question for me to think of, and I decided not to. Well, as far as the broad economic policy and the narrow financial policy and what the Minister of Finance should take, well, of course, Bunge thought that broad economism or economic policy was the state using all sorts of economic tools, not only the central bank or the Minister of Finance mechanisms, but the whole range of mechanisms. And of course, but the opposite is the finance, the narrow finances is the policy mostly of fiscal instruments, and of course both policies have a way to be implemented, and of course now we have other examples, like for example a narrow way of the Chinese one belt, one way, and on the other hand, American policy, and of course Russia. Unfortunately, we don't know what policy going to pursue, because it's not clear cut, and this is really the policy of retail their jobs. That's the what looks like the government is doing. And when Witte became Minister of Finance, because of his reforms, Russia entered state capitalism phase. Witte thought that if Russian trusts and Russian banks win over the Asian markets, then Russia will leap ahead, and just as European banks, etc., conquered the markets in Europe, etc. And of course, and maybe we should think that consider Mitter's model as a policy of peripheral capitalism, and to look through the prism of the competition between weak and strong economies. As far as your last remark, I totally agree with you. That would have to do a better analysis of separate law, because unfortunately that there are not a lot of works that have to do with separate law, and the business in Russia the state was not cooperating very well on equal footing with business, because the state wanted to make business take social responsibility, etc. And the state sometimes even lost or exceeded the regulation mechanism to big business and also social movements, and that's I cover in my work. And I would like to Professor Blagich's comments. Thank you very much for the two stages of the evolution of economic tools. First one starts with the first stage until 1874, and then the second stage from 1885, state capitalism. Well, this stage is dominated by the principle of economic stability in terms of complete continuity of reform that went on straight to the second or to the 20th century. And to sum up, that was an instrument of imperial policy and imperialist policy. And as far as the again broad economism and narrow financial. And of course, we can look at current economic policy through the prism of this dichotomy, because Russian government not only uses fiscal instruments, but also instruments of other government agencies, and everything should work in unity. And when we look at Bunge's mechanisms, we see that this was a narrow way of pursuing economic policy, and now we want to see broadening of economic tools as it happened under Witte. And as far as the turn from European to Asian direction of Russia's economic policy, of course, the Russian again is associated with Witte, because he initiated the Trans-Siberian Railway and in developed areas in Manchuria and China and the Far East, Port Arthur, and the Chinese bank was established, and Karbin was basically built by Russians, but of course Russia then clashed not only with China but Japan and European powers, and that led to negative results, where the Japanese war, the Russo-Japanese war, lost its influence, and it was trying to regain the influence until the First World War, but it never happened. And I would like to answer now your concluding statement about the separate law. We said that it influenced the economic policy of the state, and that is a negative influence mainly because a lot of entrepreneurs and industrialists cannot get to the level of national interests, and they're trying to serve their own interests. And of course, that influences the overall policy. We also mentioned that the Zemstvo and other public associations headed by Rozhenko and Lvov not only influenced the economic policy of Russia, but actually led to the February Revolution and the provisional government that is now referred to the government of capitalists and bourgeoisie. And of course, and the composition of government changed all the time, and it could not really pursue a consistent policy. And of course, civil society was too politicized, and that was not mature enough. We, of course, we don't talk enough about it because it's outside the scope of dissertation. But thank you very much again for your questions. And Miropolsky's comments, please. Thank you very much for your first question about the emergence of and the effectiveness of concrete tools. My answer is the goal of this discussion was to conduct a historical review of the tools. And of course, that would involve theoretical and practical sources tying into the concrete historical context, and I looked through historical lens, and when I look at we of course looked at the evolution, and the history was not linear. And if you look at the 20th century, look at the policy of this that we are seeing now, is that Russia's policy is now an imprint of Western policy, and that happened before when Russia implanted foreign standards in their own policy. And answering your question number 2 about the theoretical weakness in terms of statistics, well, if we look at the national statistics, it was very weak. Every ministry had their own accounts and published their own reports, but consolidated reports were not published. And there was a reference book, the White Book, by the Russian. Published by the Russian Academy of Science in 1905, there was an aggregate table of Russian economic growth, and this was actually the combination of research done by an American specialist and a Russian scientists, but the methods of these statistics analysis were not revealed. Unfortunately, that was a drawback, and since we didn't want to produce our own parallel analysis and provide our own tables. Maybe we should have done that, but this was again too much to cater to, and again, so it was difficult to conduct a negotiation. As far as your last statement that had to do with statistical analysis, I already answered this question when we talk about the discretion, the discontinuity of the tools and the lack of linking of that period with Russia, I can say that this link was interrupted by the Soviet Union, and they and of course, some scholars believe that there are analogies, and history teaches wisdom, and we can, of course, teach that. But we cannot demand of the Mr. Reshkin, Minister of Economic Development, to follow with his policies. And I would like to. So maybe it should be recommended. Maybe based on your dissertation, maybe to become with even for Maxim Reshkin, though it would be too hard a task and might be unattainable. And of course, unfortunately, we cannot recommend much to him. But of course, we because he won't listen, but would like to, of course. And of course, thank you very much for the comments about classification, and I agree partially with this with these comments. 150 years ago, we could not we cannot reuse some instruments that were used 150 years ago, because we sometimes forget what we used 15 years ago, and we can compare, of course, banknotes, for example, that were in circulation at the time, and now both were surrogates, but you know that there were other surrogates in the new economic policy period. There was bread and other products that were surrogates of exchange, and economics history, of course, studies discrete material, and it can provide short treatments of historical material for contemporary use. And the next thing about the principle, the goal, and instruments. And of course, I agree with that. And the systemic way of treating the period. And I think that in historical economic research, dialectical methods have not been, the utility of historic dialectical methods has not been exhausted yet, and because practice informs economic thought, and why the baggage of such useful instruments was lost so fast. Well, of course, unfortunately, it was shut down by the February Revolution and then the October Revolution, and now, of course, we have to. And again, the same thing happened to the Soviet economic instruments. And I would like to thank Professor Malyshin for his questions about the research of instruments for pre-revolutionary Russia, used in pre-revolutionary Russia. Currently, there's not much literature on this this topic. But of course, there were some studies, and probably in the three-volume history of economics of Russia, and some monographs on Russian economic theory are manifest. Including by Bogomazov, Ryazanov, and others, we draw on. And there's academic literature that I cited, and some particular issues were touched upon in many authors that we also used.
So as for the contemporary market conditions, I absolutely agree that I will stay focused on the relations between the instruments of the past and the instruments of the present. As for the protectionism policies and a more successful development, apparently, the idea is that protectionism implies a broader scope to implement customs duties and tariffs to boost domestic policies and economics. However, once a country is a member of some unions and organizations, autonomous tariffs and duties are a rare thing. The regular practice is that duties and tariffs are bargained. Those are the results of checks and balances procedure. And this is what we see in the activities of WTO, which means that Russia was pursuing a protectionism policy towards its goods. The next comment on being more critical, well, it is a paradox, but however, it's a well-known fact that the policies of social democrats were matched with a relevant course mentioned in Capitalism, for example, the research by Malyshin, who analyzed the capitalization of the Russian rural areas, of the industries and banks, and therefore the social democrats were also fueled by the Marxism ideology that says that socialism is followed by capitalism. Distinguished members of the Dissertation Board, that's it for my part. Thank you so much. I would like to give the floor to the research supervisor, Professor Debiansky. Distinguished members of the Dissertation Board, now I'm not a member of the Dissertation Board, but I'm a research supervisor. I met Mr. Malyshin when he was a master student at our faculty, and later he had a different research supervisor. He was with a different department, but life is life, so all of a sudden he joined our department and I was appointed his research supervisor. I would like to underscore the relevance of this research. What we have is what we have, basically. And probably it's not everything, but the relevance is there, unconditionally. I should note that the stages under consideration, the instruments implemented, and the economic policies were implemented quite spontaneously. There was no particular ideology behind their choice. By the way, all of those present here are positive about Vita. So the authorities and the government of Russia were kind of urged to undertake these actions. As a result of the Russian-Japanese War, Russia lost the Kuril Islands and half of Sakhalin region. And this was somehow related to the introduction of the golden ruble. But this is just a note on the margins of this defense. This is a highly relevant topic, equally as the instruments of economic policy, which are implemented spontaneously today without any particular consideration and justified by some specific views of the authorities and of the government. Well, not everything was a success. Of course, I'm fully sensitized to this fact, but I'm a research supervisor and I'm just guiding, doing the general guidance and the general supervision, but the rest is done by the defendant himself, by the postgraduate himself, but I believe he deserves to be awarded this Pied academic degree. Thank you very much, colleagues. Now we are having a 5-minute break. Well, you will have to have some rest. Please, I urge you to switch off the broadcasting. Please switch on the online broadcasting. So we proceed to the voting procedure. It is an open voting. I address all the members of the dissertation board. Professor Blagich, what's your opinion? I'm in favor of the dissertation. Professor Miropolsky, I'm in favor of the defendant. Pass. Professor Sukharev, in favor, as I said, pass. Professor Lemeshenko, me too, pass. I'm in favor of the defendant as well. The defendant deserves to be aspired to the to be awarded the aspired academic degree. Out of the 5 members of the dissertation board, considering the dissertation by Ivan Malyshin, submitted in compliance of the academic degree of Doctor of Philosophy and Economics in specialty 080001 Theoretical Economics under the title Evolution of Economic Policy Instruments in Russia in the late 19th, early 20th century. All the 5 members of the dissertation board have voted in favor, 0 abstentions, 0 not in favor. Therefore, Ivan Malyshin deserves to be awarded the aspired academic degree. Mr. Malyshin, your concluding remark. Distinguished chair of the dissertation board, distinguished members of the dissertation board, distinguished supervisor, and distinguished members of the audience, I would like to extend my passionate gratitude for your support, for your thorough consideration of my dissertation, for your reports that are highly valuable to me and that I will consider in my future academic and scholarly endeavors. Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be awarded this aspired academic degree, and I cannot even believe that I'm a Doctor of Philosophy in Economics. Thank you so much. The dissertation board meeting is adjourned. Thank